Hello, good morning, and welcome back to session 2. I'm Mark Stephen. I'm going to be chairing this session. Now, technology has, nobody could argue with the fact that it's brought huge benefits, but it's also brought certain dangers, certain risks, not least of which to our privacy in what has become a data-driven age. In this session, we're going to be exploring some of the issues surrounding that. At any stage, you can go to the bottom of your screen and put in a question to any of the 3 speakers, and I'll try and get through as many of the questions as I can at the end of the session when we've got a Q&A. Our first speaker is Mohamed Khamis, who's lecturer, School of Computing Science at the University of Glasgow. And what he wants to talk about is security, obviously, and privacy in what is a ubiquitous computer age. So over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. So hello, everyone. So as Mark said, my name is Mohamed. I'm a lecturer in the School of Computing Science at the University of Glasgow, where I lead a research group working in human-centered security. I'm going to tell you a bit today about the research that we are doing in that domain with a focus on building secure and privacy-aware ubiquitous systems. So I'll start by showing you this slide here, showing a scenario. So this is a person, a user that is entering a password on their mobile phone. They're authenticating on their phone. So the user is entering a PIN, and then the user leaves the phone temporarily, for example, to go get a cup of coffee. And then somebody comes in the meantime with a thermal camera and takes a thermal image of the touch screen of the phone. Now, this thermal image, you can see it here in the slide on the right. And what it shows is not only which digits were pressed as part of the PIN, but also the order in which they were pressed, because the most recently touched digit is the warmest one. Now, to generate the thermal image you can see in that slide, we used a high-end thermal camera it cost around £6,000, so that was an expensive one. But then actually, you could go online now on any online shopping store, and you can actually look up thermal cameras, and there you can get a really cheap one. So there are some that are even less than £200. This one, for example, you just attach it to your phone, and suddenly you have yourself a thermal camera. There are even now phones that come with integrated thermal cameras. So basically, what I just showed you in the previous slide is what we call a thermal attack, and not because everybody is able to get that thermal camera, there is a high potential that there's a high probability that people will be able to get these cameras and perform these attacks. Now, of course, as I said, the one we used in the previous slide was a more expensive one. But the thing is, a couple of years ago, it would have not been possible to get a thermal camera for that is as cheap as £200. And the thing is that every year, all of these sensors are becoming better, hardware is becoming cheaper. Eventually, we will get there, and we will have thermal cameras that are capable of doing these attacks, and they're at the same time affordable, and anybody could use them without any technical expertise that would allow them to perform, for example, to hack into a network or something like that. So now we have less tech-savvy people able to do such attacks that impact our privacy and security. So one objective of our research is to try to identify threats to security before the relevant technologies become ubiquitous. So as we've heard yesterday in the afternoon panel discussion, there are some vulnerabilities that are not well exploited, but once they become easier to exploit, suddenly the attack surface increases dramatically. So similarly, like malicious use of thermal cameras might be one vulnerability that maybe if it's not even well exploited today, once they become accessible to people with low technical skills, the attack surface will increase, and people will be able to perform these attacks in a much easier way. So in this talk, I'll be telling you a bit about how we address novel threats to security that are caused or facilitated by ubiquitous technologies. And first, a little bit of a background. So the term ubiquitous computing came up towards the end of the last century, and there was this nice paper published by Mark Weiser, who was actually called the father of ubiquitous computing. And he said that we would have in the 21st century tabs, pads, and boards. And the way he described them, actually, they look very similar to what we have today and what we call smartphones, tablets, and laptops and public displays. So what he described as tabs look like what we have today as smartphones, and so on. So we are actually there already. We have these ubiquitous technologies already around us. And it's come a long way since then as well. So today we have, for example, clothes that you can interact with. There are smartwatches. There are smartphones that can track your eye movements and can tell where you're looking on the screen. You've got smartphones that can do facial recognition. And these are all great things. They have tangible benefits to their users and businesses and so on. But then they also come with implications on privacy and security. So these ubiquitous technologies, they come with strong computing power and a myriad of sensors. And this brings two challenges. So as I said earlier, non-tech-savvy adversaries can use these technologies maliciously. So that's one problem, like with the thermal camera issue, that without any technical skills, you can just grab a thermal camera, take a thermal image of a keyboard or a touch screen, and then you can tell the input that was provided on that interface in the last minute or so. And the second challenge is that some of these ubiquitous systems, they come with novel security and privacy needs. And I'll give you an example about this in a few slides. So our vision here is to try to make ubiquitous computing secure and privacy aware, and we try to achieve this by doing two things. So first, we try to understand the privacy and security implications of novel ubiquitous systems, and then we try to actively secure and protect privacy on these systems without compromising their usability. And I'll emphasize usability a lot throughout this talk, and I'm happy that actually this was brought up in previous talks yesterday and today. I'll come back to usability in a few moments. But then to achieve this vision and try to secure ubiquitous systems, we go through a 4-step procedure. So first, we scout for potential threats that are caused by these ubiquitous technologies. So we keep track of newer technologies, newer sensors, and then we try to, when we find something that could be used maliciously, we keep track of that, and then the second step, we try to empirically verify that there is actually a threat. And this is not actually just a sanity check to make sure that the threat is there. We also try to employ empirical methods such as user studies, observations, and questionnaires, and so on, to also try to better understand the threat and its impact on users. And I'll also give an example in a few moments about it. And then the third step is to develop methods to overcome this threat. And the final step is to evaluate usability and the security of the approach. So here I say usability again. And actually, this is an iterative process. So usually, after evaluating the usability and security, we might go back to step 3 and revisit the development of our method and then change things about it, evaluate it again, and so on. Now, I mentioned that I emphasize usability a lot, and I'll bring this up again. And when talking about usability and human-centered design, I think that this is very important. It's very important to build something that is built around the users of your system or the employees of your organization. And I'll give you an example from a situation that happened in a hospital in the United States where they tried to have to improve security in a way, but because usability was kind of ignored, it kind of backfired at the end. So that's the problem that happened is that there was this hospital that needed, or they thought about having portable workstations in their wards. And the idea was that for medical staff to access patient data, they wouldn't have to go back to a certain location to access the patient data. They would instead do it by accessing data through this portable workstation. And because, of course, this is sensitive data, the engineers that built that system thought, okay, let's put a proximity sensor. And this proximity sensor would tell us when the user of the system has walked away from the workstation. And if this happens, then we lock down the system. So this way we secure the data. And as you can imagine, this was very frustrating to the medical staff because actually people were locked off way more frequently than they would want. And as a result, it was frustrating and wasted a lot of time. So what they started to do is that they started to put plastic cups in front of the proximity sensors to trick the proximity sensor into thinking that they are still there and keep the system on. And at the end, the hospital started recruiting, asking their security personnel to go and collect these cups. So you can see here an example of, people working around the security system because usability was not really part of this development process. If you build a system that is very difficult to use, it's very natural that people will try to work around it. It's important to keep in mind, and this was brought up several times today and yesterday, that what's the actually aim or the purpose of, what's the goal of your employee or the goal of your user or your business? Probably it's to do something, for access data, update something, use the computing system to achieve a task, right? Nobody actually logs into or like turns on their computer with the aim to install updates or to patch something or to authenticate, right? So in that example I showed you about the hospital, the medical personnel, they wanted to access the patient data. And if you just say, I'll make it secure, I'll just add something in between to, you know, make sure that this is the right person. The problem is that at that point, you start to introduce a usability security trade-off. If you add security as an afterthought, this is the problem that you encounter. You usually reduce usability a lot. So what we're trying to do is that we are trying to build systems that are both usable and secure. So, and keep in mind that if a system is not usable, people may not be able to use it properly. People may misuse it or work around it to achieve their tasks. So it's important to pay attention to usability. And I like this quote from the National Cybersecurity Center from a talk they gave in 2017, that security must work for people. And if security doesn't work for people, it doesn't work. And just to give you an easy to grasp example, let's say that to overcome this thermal attacks problem that I presented earlier, let's say that I can come up with a method to unlock your phone, which is more secure against thermal attacks, for example. So let's say that unlocking your phone takes 1 second, and then this new fancy secure method takes 6 seconds. So that's 5 more seconds, right? Now, people on average unlock their phones 40 times a day. So there has been studies about this, and yeah, that's an average number of times people unlock their phones every day. So by introducing a method that requires 5 additional seconds, you're actually adding 200 seconds a day for each of the people using their phones to unlock their phones. If you multiply this by the number of days in the year, you end up with 20 hours a year. And so this means that in 60 years, you will have spent more than 50 days of your life unlocking your phone 24/7. So you can see how a small change like that could accumulate. And you multiply this by the world population or the number of people using phones to see how much time humanity has lost unlocking their phones. So actually reducing the authentication time, or the time it takes you to log into your phone, might sound like something trivial if you reduce a few seconds, but it actually is important. So back to the 4 steps that I described earlier. So first, we identify a threat, we empirically verify it, and then we develop methods to overcome it, and then evaluate the usability and security of these new methods. So the first 2 steps are more about understanding the threat, and the second 2 steps are about creating systems to protect privacy and security. I'm going to mention an example in each direction. So first, about understanding threats. I mentioned the example of thermal attacks, so I'm going to expand a bit on that. So again, just to recap, the thermal attack, the way it occurs is that somebody could take a thermal image of a touch screen or a keyboard after somebody has entered something sensitive on it, and this would reveal the input. So the reason this works is that humans, we are warm-bodied, right? So if we touch a surface that is cooler than us, heat is transferred from our body to that surface, and this leaves heat traces, which could be tracked or detected using a thermal camera. So what we did here now is that we realized, okay, there is some sort of a threat that is caused by thermal cameras. Now, the second step was to try to empirically verify that threat. So to do that, we ran a user experiment where we invited a bunch of people. We invited 18 people. We asked them to enter pins and also Android patterns, since these are popular on Android. We asked them to enter those on mobile phones. And then they had to put the phone in a placeholder, and there was a thermal camera taking multiple thermal images at multiple timestamps. So we investigated the properties of the passwords that could make them secure or less secure against thermal attacks, and we also studied how the age of the heat trace might have an impact. And then we measured how successful a thermal attack could be after if an image is taken, for example, in 30 seconds time. So we found, for example, interestingly, we expected that if we have duplicate the inputs on a touch screen, that this would actually make the thermal attack harder to perform, because the heat traces kind of distort the older heat traces. But it turns out that this actually significantly reduces the password space, and thermal attacks are still possible even if you have duplicate digits. So the drawback of having duplicate symbols in your passwords outweigh any benefit that you could get against thermal attacks. So we should always avoid having duplicate symbols in our passwords. And then when we looked into log patterns, we found that actually if you have some overlaps in your log patterns, they become harder to attack because then it becomes harder to identify the direction of the input. And then when we looked into the age of the heat trace, we tried to take thermal images at different timestamps, and this revealed to us that actually attacks could be performed even 60 seconds after input has taken place. So if, let's say, you've entered a password, you've left your computer or touch screen for any reason, up to 60 seconds later, somebody could come in with a thermal camera and find out what you have typed. So the accuracy of the attacks are very high at the beginning. They go lower over time. Up to in the first 30 seconds, it's actually highly successful, up to 90% success in identifying the input. So now we've empirically verified the threat. The following step is to develop methods to overcome it. And actually, just by looking at the results, you can see that if we use longer pins or you use more overlaps, you actually protect against thermal attacks. Biometric authentication is another direction, which is until now we don't see we haven't found that thermal attacks are successful against them. Although actually, in the particular case of mobile phones, usually pins are used as backup in case the fingerprint doesn't work. So this means that you fall back to pins again, and this brings back all the disadvantages of pins and all these knowledge-based methods. There are other methods that you could use, such as there are ideas and research, and also some like startups are trying to look into using eye tracking to enter passwords on your phone or authenticating on the phone. And currently, we're also we are currently also building solutions as well to the problem, and this is a part of two projects that are funded by the EPSRC and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So the idea here is that we're starting to see some patterns in the user's interaction behavior, and these patterns, they make their input vulnerable. So for example, the way you type or how fast you type, this has an impact on how successful an attack can be. And what we're doing now is that we're working on detecting these patterns using AI-driven methods, and then trying to predict vulnerability based on your typing and input behavior. And we also have partners on the project, such as Logitech, who are, and of course, one of the biggest manufacturers of input peripherals and touchscreens. And they're giving us feedback throughout the project, and we hope that in the end we have something that we can integrate into existing devices without, much additional overhead or requiring users to authenticate in a different way or so. I'll quickly talk about one final example where we've tried to create a system to protect security, to improve the security of an existing system. And one domain that we looked into is virtual reality. So virtual reality is becoming more and more ubiquitous now. So now there are virtual reality headsets that are very affordable, and actually you can use your phone as a VR headset now. So you can get the so-called Google Cardboard for £15 or something, and then you just slide the phone in and you can access virtual environments. And there are things that are coming up like virtual shopping, like online shopping. There are also, Facebook is launching soon Facebook Horizon, which is like a new social network that is going to be in virtual reality. And then, of course, in virtual reality, you might need to authenticate to make purchases or verify your identity. And the current methods that we see on today's headsets are things that we know that haven't been working for quite some time. Things like pins, for example, or drawing patterns. And if you look at this slide here, you can see that person entering a pin on the left. And because he's moving his hand, because he has to hold a controller to provide input. And by moving his hand to the top left, you can tell that he's entering the digit 1 of the PIN, right? So we need to really use methods that are not that easy to observe and more secure. So here we just did a study where we recorded people while entering passwords while having the VR headset on their heads. And we found that a lot of their inputs can be detected just by looking at them, by observing them, basically. So we found, we empirically verified the threat now by doing this study, and then the following steps to try to develop methods to overcome that threat. So we started looking into ways of entering passwords using your eyes and virtual reality. So many VR headsets, they come with eye trackers that can detect where you're looking, and this could be used to enter passwords using your eyes. This wouldn't be observable. It was unfortunately slow, though, so because of that, we tried to improve the usability of authentication in VR. We developed some methods that exploit the 3D nature of the environment that you're in virtual reality. So we have this now cube with different digits, and you kind of enter passwords by selecting digits from different sides of the cube. And this is very difficult to observe for someone who's not wearing a headset. Of course, then we ran evaluations to evaluate the usability and the security of this approach. So in that respect, we focused on security against observation attacks. So if somebody's standing next to you and watching you while you're entering a password, would they be able to tell your password or not? And then we measured also how fast people could enter passwords using this method. So to conclude, there are 3 main takeaway messages that I like to share here. So first, we need to anticipate how ubiquitous technologies could be used maliciously, and we should try to proactively design methods to protect users from them. So things like thermal imaging, eye tracking, for example. I mentioned about using ideas about using eye tracking to improve security, but also just the fact that there's a device that can track your eyes has privacy implications. So this is something that we should also look into. If you have a thermal camera in your workplace, you need to know what kind of danger this could bring as well. If somebody accesses the thermal images. And second, it's important to run empirical studies to better understand the threats and the user's needs. And finally, it's important to design methods that are both usable and secure. And with this, I conclude.
Thank you very much for that. If an additional 5 seconds logging in results in a 60-year life in 50 days wasted logging in, I wonder if anybody's calculated how much time humanity wastes looking at their phones once they've logged in. I hope not. Our next speaker is Cristina Costache, privacy lead at Strauss Coffee, and she wants to look at cybersecurity in privacy frameworks. So, Cristina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Hi, everybody. My name is Cristina, and I'm a privacy practitioner. In this presentation, I want to direct your attention toward the general landscape when it comes to global risks, privacy landscape, privacy fines, overlapping of controls in cyber and privacy, but also where they diverge, Chief Information Security Officer and Data Protection Officer interactions. I want to tell you what I tell the cyber professionals in my company, my colleagues, that you can have cybersecurity without privacy, but you cannot have privacy without cybersecurity. And why? Because security is a legal obligation in the privacy field. Citing the, let's say, I chose 2 Data Protection Act, and the Dpia. So according to the Data Protection Act, the 6th data protection principle is the fact that personal data process must be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data using appropriate technical and organizational measures. It says that my microphone should be up. Okay, this is better. Hi. This is up. Yes.
Cristina, would you mind just saying, so I don't know, what did you have for breakfast this morning? It's just, there's something gone wrong with the sound level. So let's just check. It'd be a shame not to be able to hear you.
Yeah, so sorry, just coffee. Is this better?
That's much better. I mean, if you might have to slightly shout a bit, but certainly I can hear what you're saying now, and I was struggling. Would you take it right back up to the very top where you started? Would you mind?
Okay, not a problem.
Okay,
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. So I'm Cristina, and I'm a privacy practitioner. In this presentation, I want to direct your attention toward the general landscape when it comes to global risks, privacy landscape, privacy fines, overlapping of controls in cyber and privacy, but also where they diverge, Chief Information Security Officer and Data Protection Officer interactions. I want to tell you what I tell the cyber professionals in my company, my colleagues, that you can have cyber security without privacy, but you cannot have privacy without cyber security. And why is that? Due to the fact that security is a legal obligation in the privacy field. Citing the Data Protection Act, the sixth data protection principle is that personal data processed might be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data using appropriate technical and organizational measures. And in this principle, appropriate security includes protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing and against accidental loss or destruction. Each controller and each processor must implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security that is appropriate to the risk arising from the processing of personal data. Also, Article 5 of the GDPR has established security as one of the main principles related to the processing of personal data. The same as the Data Protection Act, Article 32 of the GDPR further defines this obligation as applicable both to controllers and processors. And also, this is why the European Data Protection Supervisor stated that improving cybersecurity is essential for safeguarding fundamental rights and freedoms, including the right to privacy and to protection of the personal data, and strongly supports the proposal of comprehensive package of relevant, effective technical and organizational measures. So let's take a look at the general landscape. I'm sure that, and I know that for the last day and today also, the general context of cybersecurity threats in the COVID context has been widely discussed. But I want to direct your attention towards the report that has been published by the World Economic Forum on January 19th on the global risks. In this report, that is based on the Global Risks Perception Survey, they map as top risks by likelihood cybersecurity. The report states that business, government, and household cybersecurity infrastructure or measures are outstripped or rendered obsolete by increasingly sophisticated and frequent cyber crimes, resulting in economic disruption, financial loss, geopolitical tensions, and social instability. And when it comes to global impact, IT infrastructure breakdown is indicated. Deterioration, saturation, or shutdown of critical physical and digital infrastructure or service as a result of systemic dependency on cyber networks and technology. Moving on to the privacy landscape when it comes to how it's regulated. Here we have a presentation on how the privacy landscape looked like back in 2015. As you could see, the number of countries having privacy legislation is fair, but the number of countries having strong or restricted privacy legislation was somewhat reduced. Moving on to 2021, we can clearly see how everything has changed. So in the last 16 years, let's say post-GDPR era, something has changed. Now we have around 66 of the countries all around the world having privacy legislation in place, and most of them having privacy legislation that is very restrictive, and 10% of the total countries in the world having draft legislation put in place. So let's see why this is, let's say, very important from companies' point of view, and take a look at the data protection fines. This is a tracker of fines that was valid, or that this is data related to October 2020. As we can see, insufficient technical and organizational measures to ensure information security has amounted up to €335 million. If you would, let's say, click the link on the slide and see the data that is now presented, this is slightly different, and breach, let's say, fines no longer held the first place due to the fact that this tracker no longer reports the UK data post-Brexit. Anyhow, I think that in the following months, breach or fines related to breaches will go back to being number one due to the fact that this is the most is the easiest thing to see, because breaches are always or most often than not public, or become public knowledge. So it is very easy for a supervisory authority to find out or to investigate such an infraction. Moving on to privacy frameworks. So this data is extracted from the Privacy Governance Report for 2020, issued by the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Organizations have reported that they use the following privacy frameworks for benchmarking: NIST Privacy Framework at 28%, ISO 27701 at 23%, a framework developed by a third party at 21%, AIPT Governance Report 13%, American Institute of CPAs Privacy Management Framework at 11%. My opinion is that any framework is better than none, but custom-built ones tend to aid more the organizations. On the other hand, organizations that have to constantly prove their privacy compliance or GDPR compliance to their customers, certifications to a recognized standard is the easiest way to do such a thing. So, as always, one shoe does not fit all. I think that we will see more and more frameworks, codes of conduct, and privacy certifications in the future. So, for the next part of the presentation, I chose some of the main controls that both overlap and differ in the cyber and privacy frameworks. I think that you are familiar with them all from a cyber perspective, but I want to show you the vision of the privacy practitioner related to these controls and how they link to a privacy program or privacy framework. Asset management. So for cyber, maintain a correct and updated inventory of hardware assets for the purpose of obtaining and continually updating an accurate inventory of all IT resources in order to discover security gaps related to the assets presence or configuration, enforcing security requirements to rapidly address identified gaps. But for privacy, maintaining a correct and updated inventory will be for all hardware assets, and including all goods, regardless if they are connected to a company network or not. So for my privacy program, an asset could be a file cabinet that doesn't have a replica in the cyberspace. Why do we need such an inventory in the privacy program? Because this is the only way to obtain a comprehensive image of the data flows because of the location of data. Don't know if the Strauss tool was subject of the previous presentations, but in short, is the case that led to the validation of the privacy shield, which was the main mechanism for transferring data from the EU to US. And also because we need technical controls to be put in place over the data processing. We have something that we call Article 30 registry, which means that you have as an organization an obligation to have a registry of all the processing activities that you do. And in that processing registry, you need to list technical controls for each processing activity. And as technical controls cannot be put on activities, but only on assets, we need a very, very good list related to the assets that hold or allow for data flows. Training and awareness. So now I'm citing the NIST cybersecurity framework. So for cyber, the organization's personnel and partners are provided cybersecurity awareness education and are trained to perform their cybersecurity-related duties. Because cybersecurity-related tasks are usually assigned to a reduced number of employees or third parties, training in cyber differs a lot from training in privacy. In privacy, more or less, the definition is the same according to the NIST privacy framework, but we might look differently on the way or how we need to train our employees when it comes to privacy, due to the fact that personal data processing is an enterprise-wide activity. Besides the privacy professionals, they need to make sure that privacy controls are constructed and put in place. Almost all of the employees in one organization are performing data processing activities. So, as I said, processing of personal data is an enterprise-wide activity, and a lot of employees need to have proper privacy training in order to make sure that they either know what to do or know how to recognize that something is wrong and signal the privacy professionals. Access. For cyber, identity management, authentication, and access control is access to physical and logical assets and associated facilities is limited to authorized users, processes, and services, and is managed consistent with the assessed risk of unauthorized access to authorized activities or transactions for the purpose of ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Besides all of that, in case of privacy, we need, besides having a clear picture of who has access to what, we need to make sure that in case of personal data, the access is limited to only the specific data needed per purpose and specific function or third party. Moving a little bit faster, time limitations, data classification. The function of data classification is to develop sensitivity labels for data and assign those labels for the purpose of configuring baseline security based on the value of that data. Of course, for privacy, besides hitting the target that is set in the privacy framework, data classification helps meeting also regulatory requirements when it comes to privacy legislation like mandatory appointment of a DPO, a data processing impact assessment, a registration of a database with the supervisory authority in certain jurisdictions, and of course, the setting of technical safeguards on certain assets. Testing. This has more in common than the other ones I chose, both in cyber and in privacy. So in both frameworks, the development and testing environments are separate from production environment. Backups of information are conducted, maintained, and tested. Response and recovery plans are tested. And last but not least, the nightmare of us all, the cyber incident and the breach. A cyber incident is a subset of an information security incident, as it is defined on the Scottish government site. It becomes a must. Notification becomes a must more and more in all jurisdictions. Besides the UK and the EU, I can list US, Australia, and Israel. For privacy, personal data breach means a breach of security leading to accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. Notification is almost always mandatory toward the Data Protection Authority and in specific cases to the data subjects. Where Chief Information Security and Data Protection Officer meet. Hopefully, somewhere in a pub in the future, but for now, this is also an extract from the AIPP governance report for 2020. As we can see, most of the organizations participating in the study have the privacy function located in the legal department. At this moment, 15% of these organizations have a separate department for privacy. The following locations where we can find the privacy function is information security at 18%, regulatory compliance at 13%, information technology at 9%, and corporate ethics at 6%. Chief Information Security Officer and Data Protection Officer should meet when discussing training strategy and calendars, overseeing development of new platforms, establishing the framework for contracting with third parties, on committees budgeting, all in all, in most of the times and with all areas of activity. In conclusion, a good working relationship between the Chief Information Security Officer and the Data Protection Officer, and also good understanding of each other's fields of expertise is the recommended recipe for good cyber and privacy programs. This is it for me. I wait for the Q&A section, and Tah Paliv, I hope I said it right.
Cristina, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for being kind enough to go back to the beginning again so that we could catch all of that. Apologies for the poor sound quality, but we're doing our best to sort of try and sort it out. But sometimes we're just stuck with it, unfortunately. Our next speaker is Paula Burns, who's policy manager at ORG. And again, continuing this theme about privacy, talking about promoting privacy-centric technologies, policy, and culture. So Heather, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. So today, as Mark said, I'm going to speak with you about promoting privacy-centric technologies, policies, and culture. This is a talk which very much builds on the previous two speakers' talks, but goes into some more personal angles. Who are Open Rights Group? We are the UK's largest grassroots digital campaigning organisation. We're funded by grants, corporate support, and it's actually more than 3,000 very enthusiastic, wonderful supporters and members. We've been working for 15 years to campaign and impact on issues concerning the rights to online privacy, the right to online freedom of expression, and the right to freedom from online surveillance, whether that's state surveillance or corporate surveillance. We are active here in Scotland, and our local activities include devolved legislation, such as the work we recently did on the defamation bill, policing aspects of Police Scotland, health. We've worked very closely with NHS Scotland on their COVID test and trace app. And next week, we kick off our pre-election activities for the upcoming parliamentary elections. And today, the reason I'm here with you is to be your critical friend. And I mean that in the best possible way. Obviously, our work is to help protect people's privacy and freedom of expression, freedom from surveillance. And it's always helpful for us if you make our jobs easier by not creating issues in the first place. So take everything I'm going to say to you today in the best possible way. I'm here to help. So the first aspect of the talk is how do we promote privacy-centric technologies? And we're going to strip this back to very simple basics. I know that you're all security and privacy professionals, so you don't need me to read you the chapter and verse of various pieces of legislation. But for the purpose of this talk, I thought it would be useful for us to just review the fundamental user rights that people have over their data per both the Data Protection Act 2018, which came from GDPR, which itself came from 30 years of the regulatory frameworks which Cristina discussed. These are the rights that users have. They have the right to access their data. They should know what that data is. They have the right to withdraw their consent for you to be using that data. They have the right to object to the ways that you process their data. They have the right to rectification, which is the right to correct errors. They have the right to erasure, which is frequently misunderstood as the right to be forgotten, which simply means the right to have old or irrelevant or unnecessary data deleted. The right to data portability. You should be able to take your data out of the company you use it and transfer it to another company. There you have the users have the right to restrict processing, which is to ask you to stop processing their data, shut down your account. There are rights in relation to automated decision making. This is also known as computer says no. If an algorithm makes a decision about your life, you have the right to have a human being review it. And people have the right to lodge a complaint about the way that you are using their data with the Data Protection Authority, which of course in the UK here is the ICO. So the reason I just reviewed what you already know is I just want you to keep those user rights front and center in your mind throughout this talk. Because what this talk is not, it's not going to be about tech and shiny gadgets. It's about the foundations you put in to make those technologies privacy-centric. And for us, the ground rule of anything is if you add digital on top of a thing that is broken, you will have a broken digital thing. So that means that if you build technologies and products and services that don't have a healthy regard for privacy from the foundations, you're just duplicating that, but making it digital. So I want to help you not build broken things. I want to help you build digital good things. So what are some practical ways to avoid broken digital things? Let's compare and contrast privacy-hostile technologies and privacy-centric technologies. A privacy-hostile form of technology will ignore those user rights that I discussed and bolt them on later, so that, if a company contacts you to get a copy, or if a user contacts you to want a copy of their data, you have to build that mechanism in because you never put it in. And that is a sign of building something on a poor internal culture, also known as move fast and break things. It's not how we do it anymore. A privacy hostile technology, and this certainly is relevant to most public-facing web services and apps is drowning in third-party tracking through social media APIs, social media beacons and sharing, ad tech tracking, surveillance tech of all sorts. And there's a deployment of what we call deceptive and dark patterns for collecting user consent, which make it difficult, if nigh on impossible, for someone to tell you that they don't want their data tracked in a certain way. A privacy-hostile technology will require excessive and unnecessary permissions, such as access to all your contacts for you to be able to use the service. And a privacy-hostile technology will create difficult or absent paths for exercising user rights. We've all heard of, the apocryphal stories where someone filed a subject access request and the company sent them all their data on 500 sheets of paper. That's an example of a difficult user rights path. By contrast, a form of a privacy-centric technology which builds in good practice from the start will build in those user rights from the start. You will design everything you do around the rights people have over their data. And you do that because you know that the era of move fast and break things is over and dead and buried. A good privacy-centric technology does not use something like third-party tracking. Believe it or not, you don't need to share everything your users are doing with 400 different ad tech outlets. You don't need to send every single page on and everything they do to Facebook, even if they don't have a Facebook account. And if you're not tracking all that third-party data, you don't have to deploy deceptive and dark consent patterns to capture the data or make it difficult for people to ask you to stop. Likewise, you don't use unnecessary permissions or external APIs or beacons because you don't need that data. You don't need to collect it. And you offer clear pathways to user rights, including the right to recourse and the right to appeal, that if people don't like what you're doing, they should be able to reach out. If you've done something wrong, they shouldn't have to go straight to the data protection regulator. You should be able to sort it first. So those are some very simple ways to build privacy-centric technologies. The second aspect of what we're going to talk about is how to promote privacy-centric policies. Now, in privacy and data protection fields, as you well know, people can get into sort of semantic fights over, is it a privacy policy or is it a privacy notice? I would stress that it's less important than what you call it as how you approach it. And what I often tell people is, don't tell me your privacy policy. Don't tell me your privacy practice, or do tell me your privacy practice. And this is where I want to get into the semantics that should matter, because it shouldn't be about what you call the document. It should be about how you approach it. So let's compare and contrast an approach which thinks in terms of privacy policies versus an approach which thinks in terms of privacy practice. A privacy policy is a document and a way of thinking which focuses on legal compliance, and it's driven by your corporate legal department. It works from a negative and fear-based perspective of avoiding fines and penalties, and there can be a hell of a lot of scaremongering involved in that. Its goal is to protect the company's ownership of the data and quite possibly obfuscate the paths to user rights. It doesn't open itself to outside scrutiny. It's considered an internal document, and it, if nothing else, it tells digital rights organizations like ourselves that maybe you've got something to hide that you don't want us to know about. By contrast, a healthy privacy practice uses legal compliance as a baseline, but goes further. It's progressive, it's holistic, it's proactive, it stops problems from happening in the first place. And that's because it's driven by your entire team. It's driven by development, it's driven by marketing, it's driven by leadership. It's not just a paralegal box-ticking operation. And believe it or not, a healthy approach to privacy never ever mentions fines and penalties. The topic doesn't even come up, because it's not about avoiding punishments and headlines. It's about doing the right thing by the users in your data. And it protects the people who that data is about. It's not about protecting your company's backside. A good privacy practice means your privacy processes are open and accountable to outside scrutiny. Good example of this is companies that post changelogs of their privacy notice, not just as a changelog, but on GitHub. So people can go back and compare and contrast and see what you've added or taken away. That should be a very baseline for practice, because things like that, it tells the world that you're the good guys. You know, you're not just looking to throw a bunch of legalese mumbo jumbo at people to obfuscate things. It's that you are integrating privacy into everything you do. So that's what healthy privacy practice does. I'd like to tell you what healthy privacy policy practice does not do, and that's engage in ethics washing. So what's ethics washing? You've heard phrases like greenwashing. You've heard any other sort of washing. Ethics washing is essentially when ethics statements and codes of practice are used as a substitute for legal compliance or as a means to cover up for the lack of it. And that can take something as innocuous as the form of claiming that you adhere to an industry set of self-regulatory principles as opposed to the Data Protection Act, or it can be something as trite as we take your privacy seriously. It's essentially patting yourself on the back for fixing problems you created. And a really good example of that is there was a company that offers e-newsletters that put out a big announcement making this big publicity noise that we've removed tracking pixels from our newsletters because we care about privacy and it's the right thing to do and we're such a great company. But nowhere in that announcement did they mention the reason they'd done that is because the previous week, the use of tracking pixels in newsletters had been ruled illegal. They never mentioned that at all. They were basically looking to pat themselves on the back as great guys when the fact is that they had just built a business model based on breaking the law. So that was a classic form of ethics washing. I'd really want to stress you should not engage in this because it also signals a belief that you hold your company above the law because you're great people, aren't you? And you mark your own homework by the rules you've made yourself as opposed to holding yourself accountable to forms of rule of law, regulation, and enforcement that have teeth behind them. If nothing else, ethics washing shifts the moral responsibility for safeguarding privacy from you as a company to the user, because now they've got to jump through all the hoops that you've put in place by substituting ethics for law. And yeah, it does tell us that we're going to need to sniff around and take a very close look at what you're really up to as a company. So those are best practices as well as things to avoid in your approach to creating privacy policies. Now I want to talk to you about the third aspect, which is how to promote a privacy-centric culture in your workplaces. Again, you're all professionals, so you don't need me to remind you of how these things work. But for all the products and services you use and create, you should be creating a privacy impact assessment. You may also choose to call it a data protection impact assessment, whatever you call it. The important thing is that you do it. And of course, you all know that a privacy impact assessment is a living document which must be made accessible to everyone involved in a company, including the public. They should have the right to access this. And in fact, this week I'm helping some people contact a company that's committing some pretty egregious privacy violations to ask for the Dpia. And they're making all sorts of excuses because they know what we know. And I'm guessing they're running around behind the scenes trying to hide it before we access the document. That's a great example of why you need these documents. So a Dpia should document what you are doing and why with personal data. And again, that is not because of what you want to do. It has to be pinned to either user consent or one of the 6 legal bases provided in the Data Protection Act. Legitimate interest is not a valid basis for the use of personal data. It never is. If you're using a legitimate interest as your legal basis for anything, take it out because they're going to start cracking down on that, not before time. In your Dpia, you should be documenting the risks inherent in the data you use and collect and process to the data subjects, that's who the people the data is about, to yourselves as an organization. That's your corporate and reputational risks, and to technical and systems. So your tech stack, what would happen to your tech stack if it was exploited? Your Dpia should be where you document your risk mitigation. What steps have you put in? What are you doing to safeguard your data? You don't have to publicize anything that would reveal commercially viable information or actually risk your security. You don't have to put a roadmap to where your server is located, but you have to document that you are what the standards and processes you're doing so that people know that you're being accountable to outside scrutiny. And I always warn people this, but always remember that your Dpia can be requisitioned by a data protection regulator. So if the ICO comes knocking on your door and says, we've had a number of consumer concerns raised about your app, can you please show us your Dpia? And your answer is, what's a Dpia? You have 2 problems that you've got to sort very quickly. So what sort of themes should a healthy data protection impact assessment cover? Cristina covered a couple of these in her talk, but what we as a digital rights organization look for in DPIA, we need to see it covering the practices you've put in place for data collection and retention, your subject access rights, which is how your users access their data and invoke their rights, the human and technical security measures you've put in place, like what are the safeguards over your data, your legal compliance, which again should be the baseline, not the be-all and end-all, your risk identifications and your mitigations. And this last bit, which I'm going to go into as really the key to promoting a privacy-centric culture, which is your personnel, your staff, and contributors. What do I mean by that? I mean, quite simply, what do your people know? So who has access to the data? We can all think of examples we have had over the course of our lives in employment where we were sat down at a computer and given access to staggering amounts of personal data we had absolutely no right accessing or even seeing. Who has access? What can they see? Why can they see it? Do they need to see this all? What data protection training have those individuals received? We'll come back to this in a minute. And again, this was covered in the previous talk. But you should be documenting, what do they know and how do they know it? What security measures do those individuals work with? If someone, to go back to that first example, is sitting at a terminal with access to your entire client database, is there some means to alert somebody in the company that they are accessing that material? How do you know that your systems are being breached from the outside? How do you know that your systems are being breached from the inside? What is put in place to protect data from going where it shouldn't? What data breach notification and alert procedures are in place? So again, if that's not just about how do you find out that there's been a data breach, how does someone internally report that without risk of losing their job? Can someone raise a concern or, God forbid, blow the whistle without all hell coming loose on them because they see the problem coming down the road, they want to help and they're trying to stop it? How do the public alert you, but how do your own staff alert you? And what procedures are in place for government requests? Obviously, you will receive requests from government, law enforcement, those sort of bodies for user data within the scope of law. The question you need to ask yourself, and anyone who's dealt with Priti Patel knows this, you need to consider what you're going to do if a government agency comes by asking for user data that maybe it doesn't need, or maybe it shouldn't be asking for, or maybe its intentions are not as pure as we might like to think. And that is where your test of your commitment to privacy and ethics will really, really be put to the test. So I did mention that your culture should include consideration of what data protection training have those individuals received. Here's what we, as privacy conscious activists, would like to see. We want to know that your people have been trained in the EU and UK data protection and privacy frameworks at the very minimum. We want to know that if you're working in a sector where there are additional sectoral privacy requirements like health or finance or children's data, that they have a thorough grounding in that. We need to know what development frameworks and methodologies you're using. Are you duct taping old stacks on top of new stacks? What is the procedure? You don't have to stay wedded to one forever, but again, that has to be documented. We want to see this documentation of your training in HR records. And if people don't have that training, we want to see them given that training in their inductions and in their refreshers. And what I'd say here is that as employers, you have a tremendous amount of potential to influence this because schools, coding academies, educational settings do not teach this at all. I was a web developer for many years. I received no training in privacy whatsoever, full stop. Not theory, not law, not practice. Everything I knew, I had to learn on my own time, and I have to say out of my own pocket. As employers, you need to be demanding, absolutely demanding that educational institutions, whether that's secondary schools, colleges, four-year university programs, or code academies, include this material in the curriculum. Because it's not included, literally, it is not included in any curriculum right now. So it then becomes a matter of top-up training. And, I when I was a freelancer, I used to do data protection training for agencies, and that's great. But I cannot train the smartest people in the world and everything they need to know in a 2-hour seminar, because that's all I've got. So as employers, please ask for that data protection training to be provided, and look to freelancers, look to trainers to fill the gaps as soon as possible. For all of these things, again, one of the ground rules of privacy and data protection, anything we're talking about here, is document it or it didn't happen. Whether it's in your HR files, your data protection impact assessments, or even your project planning. If it's not on that file somewhere, it didn't happen. And if there's something about your product, your app, your service, your data collection processes that maybe you don't want documented, that is the real red flag there to just stop and have a think. If you're afraid to document it, you shouldn't be doing it. And document it in the open again. Make everything as transparent and public as possible. What you can't make public, make it accessible to regulators and people who are going to try in good faith to help you to stop problems from happening. The first time these questions are put to you should never be when a data protection regulator knocks at your door. So that's been a very quick overview of how to develop privacy-centric technologies, policies, and culture. And the last thing I would like to say to you is obviously we are in very strange times, as I can see looking at my own living room here, where we're all working from home. And we've all had to sort of jerry-rig technology together to do our jobs. And after the pandemic ends, a lot of us will not be returning to an office. We will continue to work from home. And that's going to create new challenges for cybersecurity and for privacy. So what I would remind you is that whatever privacy-centric technologies and policies and culture you put in place for your customers and your users, you need to practice what you preach with your own team in terms of any technology you're using to surveil and monitor your employees in their homes, as well as in their offices. Yes, as Mohamed said, there's necessary safeguards you have to put in place so that, when a nurse walks away from her terminal, someone can't log in. But that's a very different thing too. I'm sure you may have seen the sort of dystopian adverts that are going around for workplace monitoring software for the home, which will report on things like messy room, or the person was away from their desk for more than 5 minutes for a toilet break. That is just hellish dystopia of intrusive surveillance in people's home that will not improve your company's cybersecurity, much less make it a good place to work for. Remember that the user rights you are legally obliged to extend to the people whose data you hold. So everything I've talked about, that also applies to your staff. And there have been some case law in Europe where the employee surveillance and monitoring that companies put in place was ruled to be illegal because it was not necessary, it was not proportionate, it was highly intrusive. And your privacy impact documentation, your impact assessments, your planning, you need to include the internal technologies you're requiring your own people to use. Because not only is that a cybersecurity issue, not only is it a privacy issue, in these times, they're essentially a human rights issue. And we have all the problems we can deal with on our plate right now, and we don't need to be adding any more to that. So that, I hope, has given you some food for thought on how to build privacy-centric technologies, policies, and culture. If you'd like to speak further or find out more about what we do, you can visit openrightsgroup.org and join to support us at /join. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to welcome back now Mohamed and Cristina. Forgive me, there's quite a lot of noise disruption at the moment. Is it bothering everybody? Can everybody hear that? No? Or is it just me? Christina's shaking her head. Right, okay, let's crack on and see what happens. I'm going to chuck in a general question, which I'd like to get the opinion of all three of you. Cristina said that you can't have privacy without security. Is it the case that Joe Public actually cares less about privacy? Which sections of the community care most about privacy? Which sections care least? Cristina, I'll come to you for a start.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's been let's say, a series of studies.
You're a bit low level again, Cristina. Just lean into the mic and shout.
Let me shout. It's okay? Yeah, okay. I've seen a lot of studies related to that, and it differs from region to region and from age categories. I have an example in my own home. So my sister is a digital marketer. So let's say she's seeing all kinds of data every day in her job, she doesn't seem so surprised or outraged of the amount of data we are sharing now in the cyberspace. So from my point of view, it depends on age category and region, and it seems that unfortunately the younger generation doesn't put so much emphasis on privacy.
Yeah, Mohamed, your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think that our understanding and our perception of privacy evolves over time and changes over time. But nevertheless, I think it's still, like Heather and Cristina have said, like, I think that as businesses, we should have sort of like a standard and try to maintain that standard. And I think we should also be kind of responsive to how this definition of privacy or understanding of privacy is evolving among people who are using our products and systems.
Is it the case, Heather, that again, I suspect if you just did a standard graph X-Y axis type thing, the concern about privacy would be, the older you get, the more concerned you are about privacy, the younger you are, the less you could care. It's almost as if speed trumps privacy sometimes. Never mind my privacy, I just want it 2 seconds ago.
Oh, I would disagree that young people are the least concerned about privacy, because in the past year, they've been the ones most dramatically affected by it. I think most of us have children who have had to learn from school on their Chromebooks. And there's extensive documentation of how many school systems put extensive surveillance and monitoring in place on school Chromebooks. And that can often do things like webcam captures every couple of seconds to see that the child is present. But that's also taking pictures of their private homes. That's a good example. That's a very well-known thing. Another good example was the A-levels fiasco last year, where you will remember that because students in England could not sit their A-levels, there was an algorithmically generated score based on their previous results, which substituted for that. The problem is that it was completely wrong. And a lot of young people's lives were uprooted when they got scores that bore no resemblance to the work they'd actually done. Now, the issue was that was a teachable moment where a lot of young people learned decisions made by a computer impact me. What are my rights? What are my recourse? Do I have the right to have a human being actually look at my academic record and decide where I should be going to university, and not a computer? So privacy tends to become real to people when their lives are adversely impacted by it. And the past year, when we've all been stuck here in front of our laptops like we all are now, has got people thinking about privacy on an intricate level. And I think that the future post-COVID will be a test for all of us to integrate the best of how we've been able to integrate privacy into our daily lives without creating a sort of jerry-rigged surveillance state to endure beyond that.
It's interesting, Matt, but so Cristina was you, wasn't it?
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I don't hear you
Your
very
voice
well.
is breaking a bit.
Is it me that's breaking up?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Tickety-boo. Right, fine. Let me try that again. Cristina was nodding in agreement with Heather, but you weren't, Mohamed, necessarily. I mean, was that just you don't nod, or?
No, I think so. In terms of young people's perception of privacy, I don't necessarily think that that younger generations in particular are less privacy aware than older ones. What I meant when saying that people's understanding of privacy evolves is that so when you think of when social networks came out and people started posting pictures online and stuff, and people weren't really aware of what could go wrong, right? But then when an awareness of this has started to rise, people started to be more careful now. But then there are newer, like now, for example, there are apps on our phones that can have access to our cameras without, and we don't really we might not even know that they're doing that. So, you know, I have, for example, this thing that hides the camera, like the front-facing camera of the phone. But I didn't have this, for a long time, although I had a phone with a camera. So that's what I mean with our understanding of privacy evolving, that we are starting to understand how the technologies around us are impacting us. Usually, people are taken by surprise, and at the beginning, there are often instances where people may not be behaving in a privacy-aware way just because of lack of knowledge or not being aware of what could go wrong. But I think that this evolves over time, and people start to understand things, and the newer technologies come in. We don't know what could be done with them, etc.
Yeah, no, you've got a high-tech version. I've got that. Basically, it's just black insulating tape, electrical insulating tape that goes over the camera lens. And I started doing that after one of these cybersecurity conferences. It's not that I've got anything to hide. I just don't want to kill anybody with boredom. That's all. I have nice happen in my machine. Cristina, talk to me just in terms of current legislation. Do you believe that it is enabling cybersecurity, or is it holding it back?
It's not, from my opinion, it's not holding it back, but there is a lack of legislation at this moment, from my point of view. So setting the minimum standard security measures in certain types of organization is lacking in a lot of jurisdictions. We don't need to regulate only the essential services. We need to regulate almost all organizations to have certain standards that have to be met at a regular basis. So, and this would encourage the cybersecurity community and controls and technology, from my point of view.
It's not always the case, though, Heather, that regulation has got a really bad habit of trailing behind reality.
I would argue that it's not regulation that is trailing behind, it's enforcement. We do not have a good track record of enforcement in the UK. Part of that is because, privacy has been seen as a very legalistic matter rather than more democratized matter. But it would be very helpful if people had easier access to rights, easier access to recourse, and easier understanding of what to do when something goes wrong. And I think we're very lucky here in the UK that we have been a participant in the most progressive and thorough privacy regime in the world, which is Europe's. And one thing which concerns us greatly as a digital rights organization is there's a big deregulation push now, having left the European Union, to sort of water down aspects of the European privacy regime in favor of our own third way here in Britain. And that may seem like a very who wouldn't want to deregulate / red tape? But again, you've got to think about what babies you're throwing out with that bathwater. And if what we're not doing at the end of the day is simply legalizing privacy invasive surveillance models and calling it a deregulatory success.
I'm sure that regulation will be. That me again?
That's you again.
Can't be. I wasn't speaking. There's something there. That's interesting. Anyway, I'm sure that any deregulation we do will be world beating. Why would people want to deregulate? Who wants to deregulate? Cristina, have you any idea?
Actually, it's not my, let's say, main area of expertise, but I think that there is a big push from two sides, big companies, that want to ease the burden, and actually government.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Mohamed?
Yeah, that's not really my area, but I think, well, I agree with Heather that, things like, so GDPR was a great achievement, and I think it would be great if we maintain that standard and also maybe develop it further. But yeah, nothing particular to add on other points.
Yeah. Listen, I'm going to make an executive decision here, folks, because I'm slightly concerned that we've got technical problems and that we're going to fall foul of them fairly quickly. We were supposed to run another 5-6 minutes or so, but I'm just going to round it off there. So, Mohamed, Cristina, and Heather, thank you all very much, and thanks for battling through the problems we've had.
No worries. Thanks for having us.
No problem.
Thank you.
Yeah,
have a great session.
Thank you.
Much obliged. Thank you.
Bye.
We're going to take a break now for lunch. For 60 minutes. Take the chance to visit, if you can, the exhibition hall during the breaks, see the solutions on offer, and support our sponsors if you possibly can. There's also the prize draws, and there's going to be some way of getting your contact details, so they tend to be there on a regular basis. We will start again at 1:30. Thank you very much for bearing with us through the technical problems we've had, and hopefully within the hour we'll have cleared them up. Thank you.